Dwayne, thank you, and welcome to everyone. It's great to see the amount of interest in this topic. The existing model of pharmaceutical research and development isn't really sustainable, economically and societally sustainable. So there's been a search for change, productive change in the process. And secondly, we now have the technology for much more targeted medicines for really serious conditions. And that, I think, then gives my third trend, greater openness on the part of regulators on both sides of the Atlantic, because they can move away from their traditional emphasis on safety, because the medicine may be given to millions of people, to one where much better targeting enables them to really focus in on the benefit risk for a particular medicine. And then fourthly, but I would say last but by no means least, the action of patients and patient organizations to really get engaged with the policy issues, and actually in many cases, particularly in the US, get engaged themselves in the promotion of research. And I think here in the UK, we've seen patient organizations like Empower, which was started by a friend of mine with motor neuron disease, pushing hard for earlier access for patients in really needy conditions. So we'll be hearing 4 other voices, apart from your own when you come forward with questions, that are describing these trends and really giving their individual perspectives. The first is Samantha Roberts. Samantha comes from Friends of Cancer Research in the US, and she'll be particularly talking about the breakthrough designation, where it came from and how it's being used by the FDA and companies in the US to move medicines faster through development. Then I'll be handing over to John Parkinson, a colleague here in London at the MHRA. John has built up the clinical practice research Datalink, and he's going to focus particularly on the use of real-world data to track medicines after conditional approval or early access. Then James Anderson of GSK will be taking on the story because GSK, along with many other companies, are actively considering these new routes for their medicines. And they've done some interesting retrospective analysis of the difference it would make if earlier access, and in particular adaptive licensing, were available. And then the final speaker will be Nathalie Seigneuret from IMI, the Innovative Medicines Initiative, which has been so forceful in creating many of the conditions for some of these earlier access routes, and they will have a major role, I'm confident, in pushing forward on adaptive licensing. Just to clarify, before I hand over to Samantha, we'll be talking of 2 different and easily confused concepts. So the first of these is adaptive licensing, which is being called by many people in Europe Medicines Adaptive Pathways for Patients, MAPS, which is an opportunity often after phase 2 for the regulators to give conditional approval to a medicine across Europe on condition of either trials or real-world data collection to demonstrate in greater detail efficacy and safety. And James will be talking about that in a lot more detail. And then secondly, EAMS, Early Access to Medicine Scheme, just here in the UK, which John and others will be touching on, which will give a sort of breakthrough designation very early in a medicine's life just for the UK. But we think that may show a lead for much of the rest of Europe, so that that medicine may be able to be given to patients before formal approval. So I won't go into more detail now because that'll risk confusing the picture further. But just bear in mind that those 2 concepts, adaptive licensing or MAPS, and early access to medicines in the UK, will both crop up through this conversation. So let me now hand on to Samantha Roberts from Friends of Cancer Research. Over to you, Samantha.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me participate today. My name is Samantha Roberts, and I'm a science policy analyst with Friends of Cancer Research in Washington, D.C. Next slide. We're not really your typical patient advocacy organization. We're more of a drug development research and policy think tank. We work by developing partnerships with key leaders at FDA, NCI, academic research centers, pharmaceutical companies, other patient advocacy organizations, as well as congressional leadership. every year we have a major annual conference where we convene leaders from all these sectors to develop consensus-driven solutions to common challenges in oncology drug development. We try to take on problems where we think there's a real potential outcome. So past conferences have led to the development of FDA guidances, such as the development of 2 novel investigational agents in combination. But in this situation that we're talking about today, it actually led to the breakthrough therapy pathway. Next slide. So in 2011, when we were still in our brainstorming process, we reached out to the director of the Center for Drugs at FDA, Janet Woodcock, as well as the director of the oncology office, Dr. Richard Pastor, and they proposed a panel that asked the question, what do you do when you have a new drug early in development that clearly has activity exceeding that offered by standard of care? And this was driven largely by the experience with vemurafenib in melanoma. So we held a conference late that year that proposed potential pivotal trial designs that could be used to support the risk-benefit determination for drug approval in such a situation. The major point of consensus that came out of this meeting was that FDA needed to have some kind of mechanism to respond to these situations so that, 1, the development program could be safely expedited and get the drug to the market as soon as possible, and 2, the number of patients placed on comparatively ineffective placebo controls could be reduced. Next slide. So after this conference, we went into sort of lobbying mode. We testified before the House of Representatives Energy and Commerce Committee and worked with our partners in Congress and other advocacy organizations to develop endorsement for such a pathway. And ultimately, this resulted in the Advancing Breakthrough Therapies for Patients Act being introduced by Senators Bennett, Hatch, and Burr. And the act was incorporated into the 2012 reauthorization of the FDA and signed into law in July of 2012. Next slide, please. So this just shows how quickly this process all took place, and we actually addressed this topic again at our annual conference in 2012, and it was more on developing criteria for what actually constitutes a breakthrough. Okay, so next slide. So what does breakthrough mean? It requires clinical evidence of substantial activity in a serious disease with poor outcomes. It conveys a lot of features that are already available in some of the existing regulatory pathways that FDA already had. But really, the key feature is that the drug basically gets VIP status at FDA. So it results in increased interaction with and guidance from senior leadership, and more of a collaborative approach between FDA and the sponsor to develop the most efficient development program to support approval. Next slide, please. So early in 2013, the popularity of the program immediately took off, with Kalydeco and ibrutinib receiving designations right away. Next slide. And at this point, there have been 44 designations announced, mostly in cancer, although several therapeutic areas have breakthroughs at this point. Some drugs, such as ibrutinib, have multiple designations for different indications. Next slide, please. There have been 6 approvals through this program, most recently Zicadia, or ceritinib, a second-generation ALK inhibitor, which was approved 4 months prior to the FDA's hold date. Many of these designations were given late in the development program. So for example, Sovaldi didn't actually receive the designation until several months after the drug application was submitted to the FDA. However, when new data emerged, FDA staff actually encouraged the sponsor to request breakthrough status so that they could devote more of their resources to reviewing the new data while maintaining the original time frame for review. Next slide, please. So while breakthrough has certainly been popular, it's still very early and remains an open question of what the impact will ultimately be. Like I said previously, a lot of drugs with breakthrough, especially the ones that have been approved, were fairly far along in their development program when they got the designation. So I don't think we've really seen yet how it might change a whole development program. Pharmacyclics, the sponsor for ibrutinib, has been pretty vocal that the designation helped them enter into a more of a development partnership with the FDA to get their drug to market much more quickly than otherwise would have been the case. They've also made it pretty clear that the drug sponsor needs to be ready for this accelerated pace. An important thing to point out is that breakthrough is not a guarantee of approval, and one concern that might exist is having the connotation breakthrough for a drug. What level of demand is that going to create, especially if the drug doesn't actually turn out to be that effective? What impact will the designation have on uptake after approval? As we've seen with Sovaldi, just because something's a breakthrough, if it has a hefty price tag, it might be difficult to convince payers to pay for it. One thing that I think will be interesting to see is, for example, PD-1 inhibitors. There are several in the pipeline. Some have breakthrough status and some don't. And that's been mostly a business decision. And I wonder what will happen when these are all in the market and some have this designation, this connotation of a breakthrough, and others don't. Another valid concern is, will this designation be too resource intensive for FDA to keep up? When we were originally pushing for this designation, we envisioned that there might be 2 a year, and there's been 44 in only a year and a half. So far at this point, it doesn't seem to be zapping FDA resources from other applications, but that's still an area of concern. Another open question is whether or not manufacturing process and the development of companion diagnostics can keep up with the accelerated development timelines for the drug. And so this has been another area that we've been working with different stakeholders in developing accelerated timelines for companion diagnostic development. And finally, an open question is how this designation will affect global drug development. Because if the pivotal trial design to support FDA approval is completely different from that required to support approval by EMA, it doesn't really help the sponsor very much. Next slide, please. So finally, I was asked to talk about the role of the patient community in drug development, and I think there are a lot of different ways that patient advocacy organizations can help. Some organizations, not our organizations, but several, participate in funding cutting-edge translational research for their specific disease area. We're also important in advocacy. I think it's important for the patient community to become advocates for the regulators to have the science and the expertise and the resources that they need to do their job with today's technology. We're also in a position to speak to what patients need to get drugs to market quickly and to contribute scientific expertise to the process. And finally, partnerships are important for goal-oriented collaboration. And there are a lot of different challenges in drug development that take everybody working together to overcome them. And I'll put in one final plug for our organization. Another example of something that's come out of our organization is LungMap, which is a multi-drug, multi-arm, biomarker-driven registration trial. We're testing 5 different targeted agents in non-small cell lung cancer. And the only way that this could happen is extensive collaboration between our organization, other lung cancer advocacy organizations, the NCI, other public-private organizations, and the entire North American cooperative group. And with there, I'll stop. Thank you.
Samantha, thank you very much indeed. And I don't think until we put the materials together for this webinar, I realized the crucial, the central role that your organization had played in the breakthrough designation. So let me encourage folks on the line to be registering your questions if they're specifically for Samantha. But let's now move on, if we may, to John Parkinson.
Richard, thank you very much indeed. And thank you all for attending. There are many, many of you. And good morning to some of you and good afternoon to the rest of you. I just want to start by making it very clear, yes, I am on the corporate executive team of the regulator, the MHRA, but the actual regulator is now made up of three centers. One is clearly the regulator of medicines and devices. There is the National Institute for Biological Standards and Controls, because we believe that, or are led to believe that in future up to 60% of all new medicines will be of biologic origin, and therefore that partnership is a very good one. And then the group that I run, Clinical Practice Research Datalink, which is about real-world data, and indeed more efficiency in clinical trials and how the two can start interacting together. So it's a very synergistic approach to the operation of a regulator with biologics and data. And of course, my operation is linked with the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, which is essentially the around data and research and all other things in that way. So it's very much a collaborative approach. So this is very much about unlocking the potential of NHS patient data in research. And as you know, we do have a single healthcare system in the United Kingdom, although it's essentially 4 different NHSs. There's the NHS of England, covering about 54 million patients, the NHS of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, which together make it a total of 64 million. But my side of the operation is now essentially around the 85% of the population, that's 54 million, and unlocking the potential of that patient data in any way to improve public health, safety and risk management of medicines. So I think it's fairly obvious to see when one starts thinking about it how real-world data has a major part to play in the early access to medicine scheme, particularly when you think of it that this is potentially allowing medicines to be used before they are licensed and also outside of the clinical trial environment. That's the point. And therefore, it's a bit of a no-brainer to say from your company point of view as well as the regulator point of view, it is about being able to collect as much data as possible, and if we can get as close to 100%, i.e. all those patients who are on a drug with under this designation, it will be beneficial to all parties to ensure that we can move the product on and get it to a proper license, a formal license situation as fast as possible. So let's talk about EAMS product, and we'll just give it a designation of EAMS product X. Coming into the National Health Service and into clinical care under this designation. Essentially, we're going to have data in primary care, secondary care, and other parts of the clinical record. Now, what we clearly saw in the last presentation is that many of these treatments may be specialist care, cancer care, but essentially all that is within inside the NHS, and it's about that over time more and more of that data, there's a considerable volume of that data already coming into CPRD, but there is no doubt that there will be more, and across we have access to the cancer registry data already, and there are some other registers which are linked into us. We have access to vast volumes of primary care and indeed a lot of secondary care data at this level. So that what we're going to be able to set up is a product X data tracker, linking as much data as we can on each of the patients that is given a prescription or has an administration of the new drug, and that will operate over time, and is essentially the use of that is agreed between the company and the regulator. And in exactly the same way as risk management plans, I'm sure you will have plans that you have agreed with the regulator on this designation of what data you will collect and how it will be presented. So that's why I say as agreed between, it's agreed between yourself and the regulator. It's not that we are intervening as CPRD. We will work to what is required and agreed between the regulator and yourself. So just looking at in a bit more detail what would go into this data tracker, and I think one of the important things to consider is even though many of these drugs may well be used in secondary care, some of the outcomes and some of the interactions you will only pick up from primary care. And it will be important to know what other drugs the person is on, and they will be from the primary care record. And equally important to understand all of those comorbidities, and again, they will be in the primary care record. So coming in from that, consultations, diagnoses, the prescriptions, laboratories, referrals to hospital, and indeed some some key facts about the actual hospitalization, although on the right there in secondary care we will have far more details of the consultations, be they face-to-face ones with a consultant, oncologist or cardiologist, as well as what happens if patients are hospitalized, diagnosis, the administration of drugs. That's a new data set which we're starting to get information on and data running in already. And in the cancer area, there is now a specific administered cancer data set. Again, labs and procedures. And there will be, or there may be, I say will because in many of the areas they're already there, there are now about 40 audit data sets, which you could say are almost registers in specific areas that we will have access to. And this is very much, this is a diagram of the way that we can present data. So for each patient, you can get their complete prior record, and you can magnify any particular part of it, and you can see in the top line there, each of them is a day, and the particular green box there is that on a particular day in 2010, in October 2010, you can see that person had a prescription for the 10 items, and by clicking, just hovering over the top of it, it reveals. And each of those different color blocks is a consultation, laboratory, events, hospitalization, or procedures. So it's very easy to have a visualization of the data. This is very much about the power of 54 million patients who are all inside the NHS system. I think some of them are obvious: rare diseases and rare outcomes, infectious diseases in children, vaccines. But this is a specific use around risk management tracking of a new product, which isn't essentially a licensed product, but is under this new designation. And I think this represents that another use of real-world data. There's been many that are there throughout the life cycle, from possible new chemical entity up to real-world use. But now we have the EAMS coming in. It's about tracking. We've been doing risk management tracking of new products, licensed products, for a number of years now. But this is bringing it in a different way. And clearly it's about the, as I've said, the ability to lock into as much of the data on patients who are prescribed these products as is possible. So thank you very much indeed, and I hope to take questions as we come to the end.
Thank you very much, John. I think John's brought in a very important emphasis here, that what we're not talking about is lowering standards for medicines, but actually tracking what they do in real-world use, which is a much better indicator of how, over their life cycle, they will perform. So now let's turn to James Anderson of GSK. Over to you, James.
Thanks very much, Richard. So I'm James Anderson. I'm in the European Government Affairs team at GSK, where I work on a number of topics around the evolving environment for access. I'm going to briefly introduce the concept of adaptive pathways, or MAPS, as it's the full name, as we see it, and then how we're approaching it, to consider the opportunity that the EMA has recently provided with the launch of their Safe Harbor platform. And I'm going to touch at the end on some of the remaining challenges that we see that need to be addressed collaboratively with the regulators and payers and other stakeholders in order to maximize the benefits that we can achieve out of this opportunity. So on the first slide, please, I borrowed a chart from a paper that's authored by a multi-stakeholder group called NewDigs that's based at MIT. This group consists of regulators, payers, patients, and industry, and have been coming together to really to try to define some frameworks around adaptive licensing that can help everybody use their language and thereby start to move towards what the EMA have just launched. So you can see the two paradigms here. On the left-hand side, the traditional model, if you like, of simplistically where we are today, where the three phases of development are conducted with usually RCT clinical studies, and then there's a single licensing event, if you like, beyond which the product gets widely used, but there is some ongoing study, but maybe not as much as they could be. On the right-hand side, by contrast, you see the adaptive licensing model. Here, the couple of differences to point out. So first of all, the initial license is earlier than what's called the full license here, and in fact it's earlier than the license under the traditional model. Secondly, the yellow section is larger, which is the patients who are receiving the product post-initial license but are being extensively studied. And this means that greater use, greater capture of effectiveness type data is undertaken in this approach. And the third difference that's slightly less clear, but there are cycles of evaluation that occur over the period of time beyond this. So I think the idea is that adaptive licensing can deliver benefits to patients in the form of an earlier initial license, similar to some extent to what Sam was talking about at the beginning. It can deliver benefits to payers and to healthcare systems in the form of more useful and real-world type data that are often requested by those institutions, and a comprehensive understanding of the medicine over the life cycle. And it delivers patient benefits to companies as well in the form of earlier revenues and potentially some de-risking of the overall process. Finally, I just want to touch on the adaptive licensing versus adaptive pathways or MAPS point that Richard introduced. So NewDigs started from the regulatory framework and which focused on adaptive licensing. However, it rapidly became clear, given a goal of earlier access for patients to a new medicine, that it wasn't only the regulators that needed to be involved in this decision process, and hence the shift to a MAPS terminology. On the next slide, I'm going to show an analysis that GSK conducted where we were looking retrospectively at one of our medicines that we launched a few years ago. So this was developed in a traditional approach. We had a phase 1, couple of phase 2 studies, and then a phase 3 which led to approval in the US and Europe. You can see it's taken 8 or 9 years here and involved quite large numbers of patients. If you click, please, we'll see that the initial studies were conducted in a heterogeneous population, and then click again. The phase 3 study was conducted in a subpopulation identified by a single biomarker. And in the event, if you click again, we'll see that the European approval restricted the medicine further to a double biomarker indicated subpopulation, so a much smaller group of patients. If you click again, please, we'll move on to the next slide, where we now see on top of the pre-launch studies a whole series of post-launch studies that were first of all required from a regulatory point of view, and also some additional indications such as pediatric patient population. Then if you click again, we wanted to conduct additional set of studies to understand the product better from a company point of view. And if you click again, there was a number of further studies that were requested post-launch from payers who wanted long-term data, real-world data, subpopulation data, etc. And if you click once more, there were also a series of investigator-led studies that we are conducting for this medicine. So overall, we've ended up doing a much greater amount of studying of this medicine post-launch than we did pre-launch. And we are now 3 years or so after the approval, and yet we've still not achieved full access for patients to this medicine around the world. So this traditional example led us to believe there's a bit of a lose-lose-lose situation as opposed to the win-win-win. So on the next slide, we asked the question, could we have, with the benefit of hindsight, approached this development program differently? And this is I would say, a semi-scientific analysis that we said, okay, if we were able to identify the smaller double biomarker patient population first and start there, they were the population with the highest unmet need. On that basis of the phase 2 study, we might have been able to seek an earlier approval under an adaptive licensing pathway a number of years ahead of the of year 0, which is when the standard program delivered. Clearly, there would need to be the blue bar, which is a follow-up registry, which would capture all patients from the phase 2 program and also those then that started to use it in clinical use. If you click again, we could have followed up after that initial approval as part of moving towards a full approval program in the single biomarker subpopulation and done either a randomized control study or a single arm type of interventional study in that period of time. Also, we felt that we should have started a registry at that stage of all the patients on the drug to make sure we captured even some of the less common kind of patient subpopulations, such as pregnant ladies, etc. If you click again, subsequent to that, we could have looked at the other subpopulations, which could have led to one or more further extensions of the labeled indication, and so forth. I think that hopefully gives a sense of what it could have looked like. Now, where we are now, and on the next slide, is that we have the Safe Harbor pilot scheme available from the EMA as of last month. This creates for the first time really the opportunity to have a focused dialogue with not only the EMA but other stakeholders as well at quite a strategic level of what is the optimal development pathway to use. Is it a traditional model, or is it something that's more adaptive, more innovative potentially, and can deliver the benefits described? There are some challenges that remain, and actually these echo very much Sam's presentation at the beginning in some ways around the breakthrough kind of pathway in the US. In particular, the question of how will this actually work for payers? Will they be prepared to pay for an asset after the initial indication where there's less data than there would be under a traditional pathway, and indeed how much would they be prepared to pay? Second question is how the product's use can be managed in the period after the initial indication and before the full one. And there's a lot of debate about how tightly it should be controlled, even though there may be patients outside the initial population who would really want to have access to it. It's important to think about how withdrawals might be managed, or indeed how a shrinkage of the patient population could happen if the data doesn't support the continued expansion of the population that was envisaged. And finally, we need to make sure that that we are ethically and clinically able to conduct the necessary studies after that initial population, the initial indication is granted. From a GSK point of view, we are looking at our pipeline to see what are the sorts of medicines that we believe could benefit most from coming into this Safe Harbor platform. And I've put three characteristics here that we're using to try to identify them that others may find helpful. So the first thing clearly, I think, is to be able to identify a subpopulation of patients in the disease who have the highest unmet needs, who therefore might still gain a positive benefit-risk ratio from a medicine earlier in the development, where there is still greater uncertainty. Secondly, again, Sam echoed this, but there needs to be a good chance of a meaningful clinical benefit from the medicine when it eventually comes through based on the early data set. And thirdly, there may be some medicines where there are real practical challenges around a traditional pathway, such as the length of time required or other things of that nature. And I think the final piece would be to make sure that the product is at an early enough stage in development where it makes sense to have a strategic discussion. By the time you're planning your phase 3 studies, quite a lot of these options are already closed down. The final thing I just wanted to touch on is to make it clear that we're not viewing this in any way as a shortcut for development. It's about accelerating the access for the patients with the highest unmet need who will get the benefit risk earlier. Secondly, it's not about rare diseases only, although I think a lot of these approaches are particularly relevant or beneficial for rare diseases, but certainly within GSK we have interest from teams across the R&D organization, including small molecules, biologics, and even vaccines. And finally, we should be clear this is not a new regulatory pathway per se, or indeed not a new regulatory, a legal framework, but rather it's a reapplication of existing tools with a more collaborative approach in order to deliver this whole set of benefits that we've discussed. Thank you very much.
James, thank you very much, and particularly for the emphasis there that this isn't really a change of regulatory schema as much as it is raising questions of patient engagement, clinical practice, reimbursement, and so on. Let me encourage folks to keep your questions rolling in. We've left about 15 minutes for that at the end. And now turn to Natalie, who I know she and IMI are very focused on the engagement of these other stakeholders in these kinds of concepts. Over to you, Natalie.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to present some consideration on MAPS from the Innovative Medicine Initiative perspective. Next slide, please. So in the complex pharma landscape, the Innovative Medicine Initiative aims to optimize drug development to speed up patient access to innovative medicines, addressing major health challenges for the benefit of society. And IMI sits as a neutral honest broker and enhance non-competitive collaborative research, provide incentive to address major unmet medical needs, create a unique environment in Europe for a continuous dialogue between all stakeholders, helps to align the public and the private interest, and finally enhance open innovation and collaboration. And through engagement of all stakeholders in collaborative research, IMI Project addressed key scientific challenges. And on the right are listed some of these challenges. For instance, building on the medical advances and genomics, IMI Project helped to try to redefine some of the disease and address new drug targets, but as well developing some new biomarkers predictive of efficacy and safety for diagnosis, prognosis, treatment progression, or disease progression. It really looked as well as implementing new innovative clinical design, new way of pursuing some data analysis, developing modeling and simulations, including as well for some new clinical trial design, real-world data, as previously mentioned, patient-reported outcome. But all that necessitates as well to look whether there is a need to adapt the regulatory processes for the new advances and healthcare delivery system. So it requires a lot of a mindset shift in all the stakeholders, and for that as well there's a need for supporting education and training, not only to the scientists, but as well to empower patients. Next slide, please. So now in IMI, we have launched 11 calls. We have 46 ongoing projects and 13 which are coming very soon to start. So we have already more than 6,000 researchers working from pharma, SMEs, academia, patients, regulators. And this overview shows how IMI Project covers the whole life cycle of drug development, but as well addresses a number of disease areas. Next slide, please. But what is really important is to integrate all these results and to ensure the translation of science into the regulatory and clinical practice. Indeed, through better science, we'll have better decision-making at any stage, from progressing a compound to clinical development, to as well the decision of a doctor to prescribe a certain drug to a certain patient, but as well at the patient level to decide to take its treatment and to adhere to the prescription. Next slide, please. So what do we do towards medicine adaptive pathway to patients? What is important in our mind is that we maximize the value of IMI project results. And as I showed before, we have a lot of projects looking at approaches to help evidence generation and decision made throughout the product life cycle, and as well new tools, methodologies, models, which may help to progress the pathway for developing and licensing and putting on the market new medicines. So for us, it's very important to understand what these results can be, how they can be implemented into all the different constituencies. So for that, we have set an initiative for a platform for stakeholders' involvement to optimize project outcomes. And IMI launched a call for tender, and actually this platform will be led now by Richard Barker and CASMI team in order to review the IMI portfolio and to identify the key barriers and enablers for implementing the project results and for moving towards maps, and to engage the stakeholders and identify key gaps which will help to produce or to drive a new project, IMI project. Next slide, please. This is a bit old, actually, because IMI 2 is not around the corner. Actually, the IMI 2 legislation has just been approved on the 6th of May 2014, and we are expecting now the first code launch on the IMI 2 early July. But what is important here to remember is that within IMI 2, there is a new strategic research agenda which has been developed, focusing on the right prevention and treatment for the right patient at the right time. And this strategic research agenda sets the framework that underpins the development of specific project or research program to be prioritized for funding. So it really set up the roadmap for the next 10 years under IMI 2. 12 key health priorities have been identified on the basis of the WHO Priority Medicines report. And while it is anticipated that throughout the lifetime of IMI 2, many of these health priorities will be addressed, a focus will be made specifically on 5 areas. Next slide, please. These 5 areas are neurodegeneration, immunoinflammation, metabolic disorders, infection control, and translational safety. Next, yeah. But crossing all this team, there is the need to consider as well what could be the support technologies in terms of imaging, ICT, or medical device. But what is more important, and please click next, is to identify the enablers. So in fact, it's to look at the activities generated from the priority areas, which will be designed considering the different differentiating enablers for early and effective patient access to innovative prevention and treatment medicines. And therefore, this is going to help to create the framework for implementing or to progress the medicine adaptive pathways to patients. And I would just conclude that through engagement and continuous dialogue between all the stakeholders, IMI, and more specifically IMI 2, will certainly play a role in progressing novel adaptive approaches to research, to licensing and market processes, and will help to create the adequate framework required to implement MAPS. Thank you very much.
Okay, Natalie, thank you very much indeed for your contribution there, particularly emphasizing that the whole value of this from the European standpoint is not just to enable patients to get earlier access to medicines, but to make Europe, again, a very good place to do clinical trials and to launch medicines early. So we have some very interesting questions coming in. I'm going to turn to John Parkinson for the first of these. Where the questioner says that they understand the value and attractiveness of real-world data, but if I may shorten the question, John, can we trust it?
Okay. I think it's important to recognize that there is no intention that the major clinical trials, which would one of these new products, would not also be going on. So that there will be certain sets of data which need to be collected in a controlled or randomized way. But undoubtedly, if you add to that the fact that there are many times when we all recognize that data is not very real world in nature, and the fact that we can use the real world data in in an additive way. So it's about adding knowledge on top of the total stack. And I think, I hope you'd agree that it would be wrong not to access this data, and it adds to the overall body of knowledge. Now, one of the facets that I have also been thinking about is whether when a medicine of this type became available, that it would be possible to randomize it at the point of care. So that's another technique that we could do to ensure that the data does have its maximum input in ensuring that we learn as fast as we can and as much as we can about a new medicine in that way.
But data quality, John?
Data quality, there is clearly some data that does not stand up, but there is an awful lot of data that does. There are over 390 peer-reviewed publications on data quality coming out of the NHS and the data that we make available from primary care and linked data. So I think, again, there, it's a balance on overall on the higher data quality side.
And if I can add a point, that a lot of this is going to be data on patients that are contained in registries where we have a lot better control over who's getting what and how follow-up is done. The next question from Kevin Van Langhem is an excellent question to which I'm not sure we have on the panel a definitive answer, but in the adaptive pathway, the MAPS approach, when does the period for data exclusivity begin? With initial conditional approval or with full approval? James, have you thought about that?
Yeah, and I think the answer's clear at the moment. It would begin with initial approval. I think what is what's the longer answer, where I think there's the need to have quite a significant discussion, is whether that's right in the sense of is that going to encourage companies to go down this route, to accelerate as fast as they possibly can the access for the patients who need it the most. Because the flip side is that the earlier that the data exclusivity clock starts ticking, the earlier it will finish. And if it takes quite a long time for a company to complete the development, let's say, in the broader population, then I think that that there is a practical challenge there. So I think that's a very interesting question, as you say, Richard. I don't think it's been considered very widely yet, but I think groups such as NewDigs, I think work in the IMI, it's a sort of question that's not going to go away. And as companies embrace these approaches and other stakeholders are getting more and more engaged, I think that question will come up from several directions.
Yeah, that's what I meant when I said I'm not sure we have the definitive answer yet, because I think if this becomes a commonly used approach, companies might reasonably ask whether in fact there could be some changes in data exclusivity timing. A next question is, how is adaptive licensing differentiated from conditional approval? Can conditional market approval be part of the AL approach? I'll tackle that myself, I think. I think it is intended entirely that way, that what we're using here within the EMA's regulations is conditional approval, or apparently, as the EMA would say, also approval with conditions. So there may be two ways of tackling that. But I think the idea is that we don't introduce any new legislation here, but we utilize conditional approval as part of this new adaptive pathway. There was another question that Samantha, in fact, threw in about whether these approaches can be used to give patient access to medicines that are already approved for condition A, for condition B, for which it does not have a label. I wonder if anybody would like to, John, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, so I'll make a comment there. So obviously that is dependent, excuse me, depends upon the coding, that it's clearly been coded in the way that you would recognize that this is an off-label use. That does happen, happens regularly. So yes, there is the ability to collect that sort of data and to make it available to the regulator in support of a consideration for a new indication. Yep, I think that's an obvious use of data.
Yes, I think it's important to emphasise that, because that might be one of the first applications for, so to speak, broadening the applicability of an existing approved medicine. While you have the floor, John, even if you don't have full voice, can you tackle, I think, with a single word, the question, what about the care.data patient confidentiality furore? Does it affect the CPRD vision?
Okay, so everything that's been going on with regard to care.data and making sure everybody in the NHS, or as many people as possible, are aware what happens to their data is an important consideration when there is a whole system approach to data as is happening. What I can say is that situation will be resolved. It's being resolved now, but during the time of it going on the last 3 or 4 months, we have not lost any of our practices, not lost any of our patients, and indeed have not lost any momentum in the growth that we're having. So it's an issue, but we're all going, it's onwards and upwards with data in every way.
Very good. Thanks very much. So going to 2 or 3 of the other questions we've got. One from Christine Meyer-Nicolai. What are the benefits from a sponsor's point of view, i.e. the company's point of view? And maybe I'd couple that with Stefan Hardinius' question and aim it at James. How does GSK value the safe harbour aspect of the EMA pilot? Is it actually safe in your view? So James, maybe you want to comment on what's the benefit from your perspective for a sponsor? And secondly, what about the safe harbour? Is it safe?
Okay, thanks, Richard. So the benefits to the company, I mean, I think companies like GSK absolutely exist to research and develop new products that help patients who need them. And we recognize all too well that there are many patients who desperately need these treatments that we're developing. So there's an absolute benefit to us of finding a way that gets those medicines to those patients faster without compromising safety or rigor of development. So having said that, there's also clearly benefits around the type of data that we will end up with after a period of time. So we'll have, if you like, a greater set of real-world type data, which will be hopefully very useful as we provide it to the payers and the HTA bodies. That's the type of data that they're looking for. So we'll be able to generate that earlier and in different ways, having an initial indication than we would via other routes. And finally, I mentioned it briefly, there is an element of de-risking of the development process by getting an initial approval and an initial launch into the market. First of all, the company will start to make some revenue, and that's, of course, important. It actually has a significant impact on the economics of the life cycle, earlier revenue. Secondly, the amount of investment before that initial launch will be lower as well, recognizing there will be potentially greater investment post the initial launch. And thirdly, and I think this is maybe even one of the most important things, by working closely throughout the development program with the stakeholders, including patients, including regulators, and including payers and HTA assessors, the overall chances of a successful development program, I think, have to be seen as higher, and experience with the parallel advice program of EMA with HTAs as well would be very positive in that direction. So that was the first question. I'm sorry, I forgot the second one. Can you repeat it, Richard?
Right. The second question is, how safe do you think the safe harbour is? And
right.
James,
well, I think
you're rather quick about this, I think.
Yeah. No. So I think it's a good question. We don't know. No one's tried it yet, but I think it's going to be absolutely safe enough. Again, the experience with parallel advice, which is conceptually similar, run by the EMA Scientific Advice Working Party, involving these stakeholders, is absolutely safe enough and is well proven. And this safe harbour will be done in exactly the same way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That scientific advice is the sort of mechanism that's going to be used here, and that's also the same broad mechanism is going to be used in the UK for EAMS, and that is is a good track record of keeping things confidential. But what I would like to do is actually think about this also from the safety and well-being of the patient, and ask Samantha if she would comment on this. And in particular, what happens, Samantha, if a medicine doesn't look as good as the breakthrough designation might have indicated, and therefore may need to be withdrawn or restricted? What are your views?
Well, they can lose the designation for one, although I think I'm not even sure what that would mean. I think they would have to go back to the drawing board on their pivotal trial design. But I mean, a lot of these drugs are also going through accelerated approval, where the FDA has mechanisms to. It's not conditional the same way that it is in Europe, but the FDA does have mechanisms to withdraw a drug if the studies, the confirmatory trials, don't pan out. Or companies can face fines if they don't complete their trials on time. So there's mechanisms in place to withdraw a drug that doesn't actually pan out the way that it was expected. But I think, one concern is that this term breakthrough carries this connotation that patients are going to think that it's a cure, even if the trials don't indicate that. And I think that's still a valid concern that I'm not entirely sure how that will work out.
Okay, no, and I don't think any of us are, because we're all surprised, or maybe we shouldn't have been, that instead of 2 or 3 of these, we have 44 of them at the last count. Let me, as we're getting very close to the end here, thank all of our panelists and contributors and those who have been very kindly typing in the questions that we've done our best to respond to. Just for those of you who are able to get to it, that we're planning a meeting in the UK on June the 2nd, specifically on the MAPS pathway between ourselves, the CASMI, that is, the ABPI and the BIA. I'm sure there are going to be many other forums across Europe for this, because I think it does represent the beginning of a new era of much more adaptive thinking in the way in which regulators, reimbursement agencies, clinicians, patient organizations, and researchers behave. It's, I think, as I say, the beginning of a new and very welcome era. It has its risks. All innovation has risks. But personally, and I think most of you by your interest indicate that unless we innovate here and take a few well-controlled and well-managed risks, we're not going to move forward in an area where we've been seeing mainly disappointment. So again, in wrapping up, let me thank Duane for setting this up and managing it so skillfully, sitting here to my right hand, and Natalie, James, Samantha, John, for your contributions. So thank you all for your questions. And I think you probably can find many of us if you have questions you haven't had a chance to ask in this hour. But since we are at the closing time, let me thank everybody and wish you all a good evening or good morning, depending on where you are.